In 2022, a flood ripped open a cemetery in South Africa and scattered human skulls across the streets of a city called Durban. Coffins that had been buried for decades were torn from the earth and carried downstream by floodwater. Residents walked outside the next morning and found the bones of their neighbours. Grandparents lying in the mud. At the same time, 40-ton shipping containers from one of Africa's largest ports were floating down the highway like toy boats. A father was walking 10 kilometers down a destroyed road, carrying the body of his dead son, trying to flag down a single emergency vehicle. Every vehicle that passed said the same thing. We cannot stop. There are dozens more dead ahead. Over 400 people were killed, 40,000 were displaced. And unless you live in Africa, there is a very good chance you have never heard a single word of this. But here is the thing. This flood did not kill 400 people because of how much rain fell. It killed 400 people because of where they were forced to live. And the people who forced them there did it on purpose 70 years ago, under a system called apartheid. South Africa is the most unequal country on the planet. That is not an opinion. It is a measurable fact confirmed by the World Bank. And the reason traces directly back to apartheid, the system of racial segregation that ran from 1948 to 1994. Under apartheid, the white minority government did not just discriminate against black South Africans. They controlled every aspect of where people could live, work, and exist. They passed hundreds of laws to enforce this. One of the most devastating was the Group Areas Act of 1950. In Durban, a coastal city of nearly 4 million people, this law forced black families off desirable land near the city centre and pushed them onto the most dangerous terrain available. Steep hillsides prone to landslides, flood-prone riverbanks, narrow valleys where water collects and moves at its fastest during heavy rain. The exact land that any city planner would mark as uninhabitable. That became home, not by choice, by law. Apartheid officially ended in 1994. That was almost 30 years before the floods. You would think that in 3 decades, the city would have moved people off dangerous land and built proper drainage. But that is not what happened. The private property market took over where apartheid law left off. Wealthy neighbourhoods on the high ground stayed wealthy. Poor neighbourhoods in the valleys stayed poor. And they stayed exactly where apartheid had put them. By 2022, 25% of Durban's population was living in over 550 informal settlements. These were homes made of tin sheets, salvaged wood and mud, built without foundations or drainage. In 2019, the city's own climate action plan identified 164 of those settlements as being in flood-prone areas. They published the list, they named the communities, and then they did absolutely nothing. On April 8th, 2022, a weather system called a cut-off low stalled over the province of KwaZulu-Natal. Unlike a normal storm that blows through, a cut-off low detaches from the jet stream and just sits in one place, dumping rain until it dissipates. Over 4 days, the rain did not stop, but it was the night of April 11th that broke everything. In a single 24-hour period, some areas received over 300 millimeters of rainfall. That is more than 3 times the entire monthly average for April. Compressed into one day. 3 rivers that run through the heart of Durban burst their banks at roughly the same time. The Amanzimtoti, the Umbelo, and the Umgeni. Walls of brown floodwater poured through the informal settlements that lined their edges. The settlements were on the city's own list. Homes made of tin and wood had no chance. They were not damaged. They were erased. In the Quarry Road settlement, community leader Nomandla Nkanula watched shipping containers from nearby storage yards get caught in the floodwater and slam into homes. She and her neighbours formed a human chain to cross the M19 highway, which was vanishing under fast-flowing water. They made it across. When the sun rose the next morning, Nkanula walked back to where her home had stood. There was nothing there, not rubble, not wreckage, just a hole. The flood had gouged her entire home out of the riverbank and carried it away. She was left with her cell phone and her identity document. Think about that. Everything you own, your furniture, your photographs, your clothes. Gone in one night. Not even debris to sift through, just a hole in the ground where your life used to be. Almost a year later, the site was still bare. In Dassenhoek, a man named Mbotho was inside his home when the hillside above gave way. A landslide crushed the house. His young son was killed. Mbotho pulled his child's body from the debris and then he started walking. He walked 10 kilometers along flooded roads, carrying his dead son, trying to flag down police cars and emergency vehicles. Every single one told him the same thing: we are rushing to other areas where dozens have died. Nobody stopped. A journalist found him still walking, still carrying his son. That is what this disaster was. A flood so large that a father carrying his dead child could not find a single person to help him. In Ntuzuma, the floodwater tore through a cemetery. Coffins were ripped from the ground. Remains that had been buried for decades were carried downstream. Skulls were found in the mud. Partial skeletons on the roadside. Elsewhere, a woman and 3 children were killed when their car was swept into a swollen river. The hashtag KZN floods trended briefly in South Africa. Outside the country, almost no one noticed. Meanwhile, the Port of Durban, sub-Saharan Africa's largest container port, was being destroyed. This port handles the majority of South Africa's imports and exports and serves as the shipping hub for landlocked countries like Botswana and Zimbabwe. 40-ton shipping containers were swept onto the N2 highway. Rail lines to Johannesburg were severed for 7 weeks. An 8,000 container backlog built up. Fuel depots were cut off. Petrol stations ran dry across the province. 80% of the city's drinking water was knocked out. Over 500 schools were damaged or closed. Damage estimates ranged from 17 billion rand to over 25 billion rand, depending on the assessment. At least 1.6 billion US dollars. And here is the part that should make you the most angry. None of this was a surprise. Scientists found that climate change had more than doubled the likelihood of this rainfall event. But even beyond climate change, a study catalogued every significant flood in KwaZulu-Natal going back to 1836. The frequency of flooding in Durban has doubled over the last century. The city floods more and more often, and the people who die are overwhelmingly the same people. Poor, black, living on land that apartheid designated for them 70 years ago. Climate scientist Christopher Jack said the legacy of apartheid is really key. Forced relocation set up structural inequalities where people have been pushed to live in unsuitable areas. The hotels on the ridges survived with cosmetic damage. The communities in the valleys were scraped off the face of the earth. And the world barely noticed. More than 400 dead. A major port shut down. A cemetery torn open. Infrastructure damage exceeding $1 billion. Compare that to a flood in Germany in 2021 that killed nearly 200 people. That story dominated international headlines for weeks. World leaders issued statements. Billions in aid flowed immediately. Durban's death toll was more than twice as high, and the world looked away. But the worst part is what happened next. The floods did not stop. In late 2023, floods killed at least 21 people in Ladysmith alone. In January 2024, more than 40 died across the province. Since the 2022 disaster, hundreds more have been killed in KwaZulu-Natal flooding. The same communities, the same promises, the same abandonment. During the recovery effort, a rescue worker named Travis Trower helped carry the body of a woman hundreds of meters up a steep embankment. When they reached the top and the woman's family saw her body, they did not scream. They did not collapse. They started singing. The sound of "How Great Thou Art" echoed down the hillside while floodwater still churned in the valley below. 435 confirmed dead. A city designed to kill its poorest people. And when the water came, the families who lost everything stood on a hillside and sang. If you think more people should know this story, hit subscribe. The people of Durban are still flooding, they are still dying, and they are still waiting for someone to hear them.